in Pomerantz, baritone extraordinary, which all of you will witness shortly. Rebecca Stipus, a dear friend of mine, my husband's, and a keyboardist phenomenon. And Devin Nelson. It's like three great friends right up here. Devin is an expert in 18th century music, particularly in Britain. So this is ideal. And take a look.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone to an exciting evening of music related to Jewish musicians in 18th century London. For anyone who hasn't looked yet, you can find tonight's program on page 34 of your program book to see the names and works we'll be discussing, which may help you follow along and map the information onto the works we'll hear later this evening. So welcome Rebecca and Ian to Bloomington. Your ensemble, the Raritan Players, has put together such a fantastic collection of works representing Jewish musicians in 18th century London, especially Myron Lyon, Harriet Abrams, Isaac Nathan, and two members of the Chevetto family. So tonight, as we discussed last night, we'll be talking about Jewish musicians whose families or individuals who faced exile from different places. Last night we heard how in Spain there was a lot of tolerance pre-Inquisition and then a dramatic change within the monarchy and the start of the Inquisition. England was a different situation though. Jews had been barred from England in 1290 by Edward I. Then several hundred years later, they were informally readmitted during the English Commonwealth period in the mid-17th century under Oliver Cromwell's administration, where there was a break in the monarchy. Even after Cromwell's death, however, the return of Charles II and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, there was no new expulsion order. Jews continued to live and work in England, especially in London. But this lack of expulsion is taken by some historians as an indication that England was a welcoming place for Jews, but that's a very oversimplified statement. So as we think of the larger context of tonight's concert, what were the conditions like for Jews in England in the 18th century on a larger scale? What political, cultural, and social issues did they navigate? And how might we see that with the musicians for tonight's concert?
Well, I'll start and then I'll pass the mic to Ian. So thank you, Devin, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a really fascinating story, and I think that we're still sort of figuring out how to grapple with some of these questions, which are far more complicated than I think we normally think, as you just mentioned. So while it's true that Jews were readmitted very informally under Cromwell, that readmission under the Restoration remained a very informal agreement. Basically, the monarchy recognized that with a robust Jewish community, especially in the cities in England, there was a benefit because Jews had a great deal of business acumen and international networks that facilitated trade and business. For that reason, it was advantageous to have Jews living and working in the country. So there was quite a relatively large and robust Jewish community that grew up within England, particularly in cities like London, as well as some of the port cities. And there was a good deal of interaction between Jews and the surrounding communities, primarily Christian communities, obviously. But that doesn't mean that things were always rosy, right? And so there was, for example, in 1753, there was an attempt to formalize the naturalization or citizenship rights of Jews within England under the Naturalization Act, informally known as the Jew Bill, colloquially known as the Jew Bill. And so for a very brief time, about a year, Jews were allowed to become naturalized citizens, but there was such a strong reaction against this, including protests and riots, that the law was overturned a year later. There were sort of continued frictions, tensions between the Jews and non-Jews, even in a cosmopolitan city like London. At the same time, Jews developed, obviously, as always, a kind of a cultural scene that extended beyond the business world. And so in London, there were Jews who became very well-educated musicians and sometimes entered the professional fields of music. And this was something that had already been going on across Europe for centuries. So looking at Renaissance Italy, for example, there was quite a large population of Jews who worked professionally in the fields of music and in dance. And they, taught in courts, in royal courts, and they published music and they were prominent performers. So a family like the Cervetto family, whose cello sonatas you'll hear today, immigrated from Italy in the early 18th century and sort of kept that tradition of professional string playing. And that's sort of how, there were a number of professional string players who came from Jewish families who lived in England. There were also singers, and so Ian will talk about those in just a moment. But I think that one other issue that comes up as Jews enter the kind of professional scene of musicianship, and there is a general tendency towards modernization and the relaxation of certain religious protocols and adherence to religious law, which is also a feature of the 18th century, not just in England, but kind of across Europe, as Jews become kind of more integrated, or at least come into contact more with non-Jewish society, with Christian society. Some of these musicians whom we're going to be meeting tonight also converted. By the end of their life, they were either buried in a Christian cemetery or they baptized, a couple of decades before the end of their lives. So what that all means, how they understood conversion is another thing that I think we're still kind of grappling with and trying to figure out. So a person like Harriet Abrams, for example, whose songs you'll hear, some of whose songs you'll hear this evening, she and her sisters baptized in the 1790s, but it's still not entirely clear whether anyone would have known that they baptized. And with a Jewish last name, she still would have been marked as Jewish or as having a Jewish heritage, just as she had been, and we'll say a little bit more about this later, as she had been when she was a young singer. So very often I think these, the conversion, when Jewish musicians did convert, it was sometimes because they were seeking that professional network in music that existed more robustly outside of the Jewish community than it did within. So I'll stop there.
That's a wonderful, concise history of English, of modern English Judaism, Jewry. Thank you. I will add just a little bit. There existed two major communities of Jews in England, and not only in England, but in the UK and its colonies. The first of these groups were Sephardic Jews. They would what we call in Sephardic parlance S&P Suspension Portuguese or Western Sephardic Jews. These were the first people readmitted by Oliver Cromwell. They came first from Amsterdam, which was also another Protestant republic, where tolerance was tolerated. Where tolerance was tolerated, I'll say that. And as the 17th and 18th century wore on, Jews also came from other places, most notably Germany, as well as Western Poland and Central Europe, and they started the Great Synagogue, it's called the Great Synagogue of London, which was Western Ashkenazi community. These two communities, they had separate traditions, they had separate what we were called Sachot, or liturgical traditions, but they still interacted with each other quite a bit, and sometimes they even shared music. As the 18th century got going in earnest, and England was more and more an Atlantic colonial empire, you see Jews pop up in England's colonies as well, especially here in the United place. Well, not here in Indiana, but here in the United States, certainly in Newport, Rhode Island, as well as Richmond, Virginia, in Charleston, South Carolina, and also in the British Caribbean. And you could see these families sometimes go back and forth from various places where this new Anglo-Jewish diaspora was, and eventually they made their own Nusach called Nusach Anglia, or the liturgical tradition of Britain. I'm specifically very interested in Meyer Leone. I don't know if this is going to answer your next question.
Yeah, so
Okay.
We've been talking for a long time.
Sure.
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you so much. So we'll talk about more particulars as we look at specific musicians. One thing I love about how you've constructed this program, which you mentioned in your program notes, is that you're trying to shift from a focus on composition, here's a set of works by certain composers, to the idea of musicking with a CK. So musicking, making music an active, varied, and changing verb, centering on the activities of music, performance of many kinds, patronage, teaching, collecting, editing, all sorts of things, to help us move from a focus on prolific composers like Handel, and change the perspective to be able to see the amazingly complex and diverse networks of music making and many types in 18th century London. So with this changing focus, we can start to see the variety of ways musicians, very broadly defined, interacted and moved between different environments at this time. And one of the musicians on tonight's program who represents this idea of diverse musicking very well, I think, is Meyer Lyon. Ian, I know you've done a lot of research on him. So how does he represent this idea of musicking and the mixing of different musical communities and traditions, and how might we hear that on tonight's program?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I'm so glad you asked it, so thank you so much. So we don't know exactly where Meyer Leone was born, or Meyer Lyon was born. His origins are a bit obscure. He seems to have been born somewhere in Central Europe, probably a German-speaking land in what is now Germany, Austria, the Czech Republic, or even Western Poland. But he shows up in England. He shows up in London as a what we would call a school-age child. So you have this young continental boy entering the Ashkenazi community there, and from the very get-go, he ends up being a sought-after vocal talent. As a young boy, he was what we call in the Jewish tradition a meshorer. It's kind of like a junior cantor and a chorister at the Great Synagogue of London, and they paid him £40 a year, which was quite a sum to give to a preteen boy. But he grew up in this very interesting milieu, and he began taking more voice lessons and becoming more and more connected with English music making, when he started taking lessons and having a long professional relationship with the Braun family, who were also Ashkenazi Jewish musicians. When he was a teenager, he started showing an interest in Baroque opera. And at that point, he starts going over to the Drury Lane Theater, and he sees a bunch of Handel premieres. He sees major Italian opera stars come in, and he says, "That's going to be me in a few years." So he goes to the synagogue and asks if he could start singing opera, if he can go to the opera house. And we're not sure exactly what the synagogue said. We do know they docked his pay, but not that much, and this could simply because they were in more and more financial straits because of economics. But they did dock his pay £8 which for a year, for someone making 40, for a teenager making £40 a year is really not that much.
But they allowed him to do so as long as, put in a contract, he remains a Yehudi kasher, a kosher Jew. And he becomes very involved in the London stage, as well as the oratorio societies and the private salons that were popping up among the bourgeoisie and among the Jewish middle class of 18th century London. So what's remarkable about him is that the opera, the Drury Lane, knows not to schedule him on Friday or Saturday, and the synagogue knows that he is booked on Sundays, and he sings an entire day of Shabbat services, and then goes down to Drury Lane Theatre and sings a role. I think this is something that even cantors today try to do with success, but not with as much success as Leone. He was doing it in the 18th century, and it's amazing. He also expanded his network into non-Jewish music-making circles, and that is one of that output is one of the pieces that we're going to hear today. There is a hymn that's still sung with quite a bit of regularity in Anglican and Methodist churches, called Leone. By the way, Meyer Leon changes his name, he italicizes his name to Michaele Leone, because good opera singers should always know Italian and be accepted in Italian circles, especially tenors. So he and several nonconformist Christians are those who are ideologically or theologically at odds with the Anglican Church. They invite them into the synagogue. And we have Leone writing a hymn on the Jewish poem Yigdal, which is a medieval resume of Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith for the Jewish people. He sings it in Hebrew in front of the entire assembled congregation of Methodists and Ashkenazi Jews, including a mix of women, which was also rare during those days. Again, this is before the Reformed Judaism happened in Germany in the early 19th century. They wheel in a portative organ, and he sings it in Hebrew, and the Methodists respond by singing 4 more verses in 4-part harmony in English with words by Thomas Oliver, who's a Protestant clergyman. And that is really our first interfaith service, Jewish interfaith service in the UK. And he manages to do this most of his life. He continues to sing. Tenor. He drops down to baritone because, as an aging tenor is wont to do, if you look at Placido Domingo, this is what he's doing right now. And he ends up. I mentioned that cross-Atlantic relationship. He manages to set up shop in Jamaica, which had a very active Sephardi and Ashkenazi community. He lives out the remainder of his days there as a chazan. And I think I'm studying to be a cantor myself, and every once in a while I find a performer or a musician from the past who resonates with me as somebody who one day sings Bach and the next day is in the synagogue, and then I'm back to Bach. So I look to him as a kindred spirit, as such, as a classical musician and as a Jewish musician and scholar.
Fantastic, thank you so much. What a fascinating figure. We have so many fascinating figures on this program, and there are certainly many paths that Jewish musicians took, not just following Leone. So these paths were often very different based on someone's gender. So we have one female composer on tonight's program, Harriet Abrams, who had a very different journey from Meyer Lyon. So how did Harriet Abrams navigate different forms of musicking in different communities in London, and how were her experiences, how do they compare to what we know of other Jewish musicians and other female musicians in the 18th century London?
Sure, thank you. So Harriet Abrams has become a little bit of an obsession for me, I guess. But she's a fascinating figure. Like Leonie, she actually got her start in the theater in Drury Lane. She was apparently discovered by David Garrick, who writes sometimes he writes in private diaries that he has this little Jewess whom he wants to present to the public, and her early reviews performing in the Drury Lane Theater focus both on her age. She was quite young at the time when she made her debut there, but also they note that she is a Jewish girl. When she was somewhat younger than Leonie, so when Garrick dies, she seems to have lost her entree into her point of entry into the theater, but she pivots and she makes her way instead by singing in concerts, in oratorios. We know that she sang at the centenary commemoration of the birth of George Friedrich Handel. So like Leonie, she's also involved in the kind of Handelian, the perpetuation of Handel's music and even its revival in the, not that it ever really died away, but she was sort of involved in this Handel craze, Handel mania, as it was called, in the second half of the 18th century. So the Handel commemoration was 1784. So she sang in Westminster Abbey. And there's a wonderful description by Charles Burney, the music historian, of how her voice never sounded as good. I mean, he admired her singing, but it never sounded as good or as well as it did when she sang in Westminster Abbey, and the architecture of the building just carried her voice. So he must have heard her both in kind of living rooms and parlors, and also in the Abbey.
And if you look at pictures of those performances, they're packed not only with the number of performers, there are like hundreds of performers on stage, 100-piece orchestras or more, which we don't really think of usually in the 18th century, but for this, there, and the audience was packed.
It was enormous. It was a huge deal. So she sang solos as part of this performance. And there's also, speaking of pictures, I'm not sure if it's in the program, but there's a wonderful picture that seems to be of her and one of her sisters together with, it must be John Bram. The theory is that, prevailing theory is that she was part of the Bram family, B-R-A-H-A-M, which was a musical family, so Abrams may have been a variation on that name. It's not 100% certain because the documents don't all survive as we would like them to, or they haven't yet been discovered, I suppose. Maybe they still exist and are waiting for us. But so she pivots away from the theater, starts singing in oratorios and also in benefit concerts for herself and her sisters, and also for the poor. And we know that in the 1790s, when Joseph Haydn was in London, she performed alongside him, and the kind of notice in the press is that he presided at the pianoforte, with Abrams being one of the singers in the concert. She had apparently started composing by the 1780s, and one of the pieces that we'll be performing tonight, a lovely duet, kind of a Mozartian duet, is from the 1780s, when she was apparently singing duets with her sister. And then, right around 1800, she begins putting out more kind of sentimental ballads for solo voice and piano. So we'll also be presenting 3 of those songs. They're really interesting, they have a kind of intricate piano part, and she uses the piano in different ways from most English composers of the time, but she participates in this vogue for the sentimental ballad, which is meant to evoke sympathy for the unfortunate, for the poor, for the orphan. So at no point does she use a text that talks specifically about Jews, but she does talk about exiles. She uses texts in her for her songs that talk about exiles, or other kind of unfortunate figures, where you kind of get the sense that she is taking a purposely, she's choosing purposely a perspective which is that of an outsider. And I can't help but wonder if she kind of leaned into that genre of the sentimental ballad and embraced that genre, partly because she knew what it was to be an outsider.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. I better let you get ready for your concert. I look forward to hearing it, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much.